Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim, resident fellow with the Leadership Institute of Nevada. I'm here today with Michael Horn, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of the Entangled Group and a member of our Leadership Institute faculty. Michael, it's great to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing with the Entangled Group. What do you do? What sort of work are you doing in education?
Yeah, so Entangled is an education venture studio. Our hypothesis is somewhat simple. It's that the world has shifted from an industrial economy to a knowledge-based economy, and our education system hasn't kept up. It's still stuck in that industrial model. And so we're aiming to help shift the education ecosystem to be able to support the knowledge economy of our times. And that means we create companies and we create nonprofits to assist both higher education, K-12 education, workforce learning into this 21st century. And we do it through consulting. We do it with companies that help provide targeted services, and we do some investments occasionally as well.
And I understand that in your work, you've traveled across the country, you've worked in different school districts and different school systems, traditional public schools, charter schools, what have you. And throughout that, you've been able to see over the years a lot of different activities and projects and styles that different systems and schools are undertaking. Could you describe a few of the big trends that you're seeing nationally in terms of taking another look at how our school systems operate?
Yeah, I think, there's obviously a variety of efforts. And one of the beauties and frustrations at the same time in the American education system is that you see so much going on. Some of the most innovative efforts, I think, have originated in Silicon Valley, where you see places like Summit Public Schools have developed a competency-based learning model in which students move on as they master core content. They work on deep projects, project-based learning that allows them to really apply their learning in interesting and relevant contexts. And then they get out of school and work in expeditions, they call it, in the community and with real jobs in the community for a couple weeks at a time, several times a year. And then they've built a platform, actually, that they now offer free to schools nationwide. And something like 38,000 students or so are on this platform for their learning. And so you see a lot of innovation there. You can see other models like originally it was School of One, now called Teach to One, that does an individualized playlist for every single student in math as a way to learn. You see a lot of software-based programs that have arisen that get adopted in schools. There's a whole range of things, I would say, out there. There's no shortage of interesting, innovative ideas that I would argue have moved the needle for lots of students.
And let's talk about that word you just mentioned, innovative. In your work, in your writings, you've looked at systems or schools or programs that you would say are innovating disruptively or using this disruptive innovation, rethinking how things are going, challenging that status quo.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say disruptive innovation, and what does that look like in a school or in a school system?
Great question. So let's start with the big concept first, because disruptive innovation is one of these phrases that you read all the time in the Wall Street Journal or in TechCrunch or stuff like that. And I suspect a lot of your listeners are tired of the phrase because it's really the way it's sort of been morphed is any entrepreneur that wants to justify what they're doing, they call it disruptive innovation. But in reality, disruptive innovation is a very specific theory of cause and effect that says, rather than attack an existing organization with an innovation that goes at the heart of what they do today, you should start with something that's simple, primitive, targets people who are overserved or not served at all by the existing system, where the existing system is motivated to ignore you, and implement your innovation there. And then powered by technology, that innovation will get better and better and better and be able to tackle more and more problems and change the way the world works. And these innovations tend to be simpler, more convenient, more affordable, accessible, and the like. And so an example outside of education is that the personal computer was disruptive relative to mainframe computers. And smartphones have been disruptive relative to personal computers. They started out as clunky, but have allowed a lot of us to afford a computer in the pocket, in our pockets, and follow us wherever we go, and have gotten a lot better over time, such that many people don't even own desktop computers anymore. Now, if you start to think about what does this mean in education, I would argue we did not have a disruptive innovation since the printing press for several hundred years, and then online learning came along and was the first disruptive innovation. And we've seen it manifest itself in two very different ways depending on the context. In higher education, you have actual non-consumption, meaning students who would love to go to college or university, and for affordability or convenience reasons, literally cannot go to college or university. And so you've seen brand new universities pop up and use online learning to reach these non-consuming populations. In our K-12 schools, in America anyway, we don't have really non-consumption. Almost everyone has access to a public school. And so really what we've been talking about is not disruption of schools, but disruption of class, how we do the classroom within schools. And so I would argue that the disruption started with subjects that schools wanted to offer and couldn't offer, like AP classes, for example, or credit recovery courses. And then they've gradually seeped into the system in all sorts of forms, from station rotations in elementary school to those bigger flex models like I described with Summit, where every single student is moving at their own pace, and the online learning is sort of a backbone of the experience, but far from the only part of the experience. There's a lot of collaboration offline and projects and the like. But that disruptive innovation is really around that personalization and bringing access to high quality content to anyone, anywhere.
Let's talk a little bit more about what a system or a school needs to do to do those sorts of things, right? To implement a disruptive innovation in their system. In some of your work, you've identified this duality of how a system needs to operate to make this happen. On the one hand, you discuss stream A, which is about taking what you already do, making it better, perfecting it, and ensuring that you're keeping to those core actions, those core missions of your system. There's also this stream B, so to speak, that can include trying out new things, going outside what your organization's done before. Could you describe for us, how does a system, whether it's in a classroom with a teacher or a team of teachers, or if you're in a school or a district, how does a system navigate those interests in order to bring about a change that's going to be good for students?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing is, when disruptive innovation is afoot, we tell everyone, don't stop what you're doing today. What you're doing today is really important. It serves students. It's really valuable. Disruptive innovations are inherently risky, and you want to be careful when you deploy them and not overturn everything because you've become convinced without any evidence that that's the way the world should work. So that's the first caution. The second thing we say is, take the disruptive technology of online learning and use it in what we say are sustaining ways. That is that A strand, if you will, to continue to do what you do today, but better. And so the classic examples are the majority of elementary schools in this country are built around a centers model. Students rotate among different centers, which are different activities. Make one of those centers online learning so that you can better personalize learning and target learning for an individual student's needs. Not a radical shift to competency-based learning where you're throwing out seat time and all these processes, but something that could be actually really important and help the teacher in demonstrable ways and use data far more effectively. At the same time, we think you're remiss if you don't try to do some disruptive stuff. And so try the disruptive stuff where the alternative is nothing. Don't start out by totally overthrowing your model, like I said, but instead start in those areas like credit recovery or like advanced placement courses, or maybe do a school within a school that's opt-in for students, as an example, or an alternative school completely outside of the normal bounds of your education system. These are all great places where it's important to pioneer disruptive innovation. And the key is to really keep those experiments separate at first and allow them to operate by different processes. So I'll just name one big one, for example. I've used the phrase competency-based learning a few times in this podcast already, and you might think of this as mastery learning also. The big idea is that our current school system, we hold time constant, meaning there's a certain number of instructional minutes you have per year, and every student's learning is variable. Some people master material in that amount of time, some people grow bored because they've already mastered, and some people don't quite get it in that amount of time. And we think you should flip the script. Instead, time should be your variable and your learning should be constant. So if you need an extra day on fractions, you get that extra day until you show mastery and you have that success. And that truly flips things over. And we think one of the biggest keys to personalizing learning and allowing every single student to fulfill their potential is really flipping that script toward a mastery-based or competency-based learning system. That's a key process, I would say, that as you go into the disruptive innovation, you should not take over the time-based system from the old and port it into the new.
You have to provide that space to try out something new without being beholden to what has been done.
That's exactly right.
Before.
That's exactly the right summary. Yeah.
So suppose you are working with a school leader or a superintendent in a school district that wants to create some space for educators to try out new ideas while respecting that students have to achieve certain standards.
Sure.
There are certain legal requirements on what a school district must accomplish under law and other matters. What are some examples of, say, schools or school systems where you've seen the school leaders be able to navigate this space to allow this innovation to take foot?
Yeah, great question. So let's go to Quakertown, Pennsylvania, Quakertown Public Schools, where they set up an online school that allowed them to share classes among their different schools in the district, and started to provide this access. And then they started building cyber cafes, in effect, in the schools, because it turns out that doing your work entirely online doesn't work for a lot of students. And so that way they could staff it with teachers and have other peers there around you and create that social environment. And then you can start reimagining what school looks like, and that can grow and grow and grow and start to transform how you do schooling. Middletown, New York is another example where they started with a coalition of the willing, teachers that actually wanted to innovate. They didn't say everyone needs to do it day one, but they had a plan over 5 years how they would bring everyone on board over time. They started with a coalition of the willing, proved success in that first year, tweaked and made it better, and then developed a very strong culture and went grade level by grade level to start to move the entire school system into these models. So those are just two examples, but the key is to be very clear and intentional, I think, about what is a pilot and then have a vision to extending that over time. You don't want to just get stalled in that pilot phase.
And to that point, as you're moving from a pilot to broader implementation, rolling something out across an entire system, there's also the importance of continuously improving, benchmarking, understanding where you've been and where you want to go. What can a system leader do to ensure that there are those checks in place, those processes in place to drive continuous improvement without having those processes become ends in themselves, so to speak?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked this question, because I didn't answer that part of your question on the previous one, and it's a really important point, which is that you don't want to do this at the expense of achievement for students and things like that. And so I would argue that this is actually going to be a far superior system in terms of student achievement, but it may take 2 or 3 years till you see those impacts, because suppose you're starting it with a student in the 7th grade who never mastered 4th grade math. In the old system, you would just try to press ahead as much as you could in 7th grade math and hope you got them across the bar in the proficiency lens, but the gaps would grow and that would probably hurt that child in the long run. In a mastery-based system, you might actually go back to the root causes of their struggles and really fill those in, and you might not see the real uptick for another year. So it points to a bigger challenge, which is that I think the system itself needs to look much more at growth of individual students and not just at arbitrary proficiency bars based on the year in which you were born that we now expect you to attain. Not to abandon those, because I think ultimately you should be hitting those proficiency bars, but you want to see growth toward proficiency and then ultimate proficiency. And so I want a system that knows where every single child actually is in his or her learning and can measure it on an individual basis so that we know we're doing right by each student far more frequently, frankly, than a once-a-year exam gives us information on. And the instruction would be much more interwoven with the system. So what does that mean for a district leader? Because you're not in that policy environment. I think be aggressive with the policymakers. There's a lot more latitude in state-based policy than people often think there is. Rick Hess always talks about the cage-breaking teachers and leaders, and there is room to create the metrics that you think ought to exist to judge your program. The mistake that I too often see districts do is they forget to put those metrics in place in a rigorous way up front. Innovation, in my mind, does not mean it's a blank space for innovating without metrics. You have to be doing right by students. If you're not, it's not worth doing.
Indeed.
People often will look at the iPhone and say, if Steve Jobs had to meet test scores, he never would have invented it. You know what? Steve Jobs did have to meet accountability. He had to get people to buy the thing, which means it had to work. And so the same thing is true here. We got to hold ourselves to that standard.
So to that point, you've mentioned some of the different audiences. If you're a district leader, you need to be thinking about certain things. If you're a policymaker, you're looking at an entire system, an entire state. If you're a legislator, for example, what advice would you share with a state level policymaker and or a school district leader, a school leader, a teacher leader at a school site or a classroom? So a couple different levels here. Maybe some advice would be the same across those levels, some might not. But what advice would you share with these different leaders in different spaces in the education system who might tell you, Michael, I love what you're hearing. I really like this idea of trying to innovate or creating space for my colleagues and others in the community to innovate. What do I need to know? What landmines might there be? What unintended consequences? Like what would you tell me I need to keep in mind to make any of this happen?
Yeah, so let's start with policymakers and then we'll go down. For policymakers, one, I would say do no harm, which means I'm not a big fan of mandates that say thou shalt have a competency-based learning system from now on. We're undoing seat time and all the rest. And the reason I say that is you got to get teachers and schools and communities to really buy into this and really build up the capacity to do this. What I think they should be much more focused on is eliminating barriers and roadblocks in legislation. So opening up the way for schools and school systems to tinker with the inputs and how they do schooling in creative ways and be very rigorous on the outcomes. And I would push outcomes to be at the individual student growth level, not just sort of this dipstick once a year measure of are you proficient or not, which is a really blunt, bad measure. One of the good things that I think ESSA has done is push us to be more creative in those measures. And so that's what I would do as a state level policymaker. Free up inputs, focus on outcomes. The second thing, if you're a system leader, so superintendent or someone like that, I would empower your schools to start to experiment and innovate. Push resources down to them so that they can figure out what's right for their community and their population, but do so within a larger construct, a larger plan of what you're hoping to see across the district and why, right? Have a clear theory of action and give some room for autonomy, but also paint a vision of what you'd like to see. Be clear about that. When you go down one more level to the school system, this is where I'd see a lot of innovation. I'd like a principal to really be proactively working with teachers to help them develop new ideas, to develop real clear culture across the school of a culture around student success, but also innovation, and giving very clear people room to do those innovations and so forth. Last, teacher leaders or teachers. Different teachers are going to be at different places on the spectrum. I think teacher leaders can do a lot. They can start experimenting with a flipped classroom, for example, if they don't have permission from their school leader to dive into the deep end. And some of them can band together and start something really innovative. Like, why not start a modern Montessori program as a school within a school in an elementary school? That would be radically disruptive, but a really exciting idea.
Hey, Michael, I really appreciate you taking time to share your ideas with us today. Here in Nevada, as conversations are ongoing about what needs to be done to best serve students, I think what you shared with us gives a lot of food for thought for our education leaders to be thinking about. So thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks for having me.